And it's really just the tip of the iceberg of some of the incredibly pressured rooms that he had to go into in some of the most critical times, including the hours and days after Jane Kriba was shot on Boxing Day in 2005. I've certainly been in some interesting rooms in the last couple of years where you're it, and everyone's looking at you, looking for the answer, or maybe just looking for someone to blame. I'll tell you the first time I met Jim Rankin. Jim Rankin dared to request an interview with Chief Julian Fantino back in 2002. His colleagues, Jennifer Quinn and Michelle Shepard, had the easy job. They got to interview me a couple of weeks before to make the request on behalf of Jim for an interview with the chief for a story that involved big data, race-based statistics, and the activities of frontline police officers. There was a lot that went on between that first request, Jim, and when I first met you, believe me. There might even be a book coming out about that. But I can tell you, when I looked at Jim Rankin being escorted onto the 7th floor of Toronto Police Headquarters, into the massive conference room, where there was seated a range of people like me in white shirts and scrambled egg gold all over the place, and then seated directly opposite Chief Julian Fantino with his little stencil pad, which he's been carrying around all day long. And then really just sort of with everyone looking at him, asked to ask some questions of the chief. I remember thinking, that poor son of a gun has got to be the loneliest person in the world right now. If I recall, that meeting didn't go too long. And very shortly after you arrived, you were escorted out of the building. And I don't know how many years it took for you to get back in again. Maybe you've never been back in, I don't know. So I've got here one of, I think, for a whole bunch of reasons, one of the best journalists we've ever had in Canada. Certainly one of the best in terms of covering crime, public safety, policing, and justice more broadly. And he's brought along another all-star team of individuals to carry on what I think has been an excellent, invigorating, thoughtful discourse over the course of the day. And I deliberately constructed this panel for the end panel because I think its importance is singular amongst all the other speakers and keynotes and panels that you've had. This one, if you are at this point, as I hope you will be, concerned about where we are as a country, concerned about safety, concerned about justice, concerned about privacy and human rights, but you're feeling like, okay, there's things happening, there are good people involved, and maybe the glass is half full, if even by just a drop. In order for us to keep that momentum going, in order for us to keep that glass half full, the folks on this stage need to be on their A game. And I hope at the end of this panel you'll understand why. So Jim, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
I'm having serious flashbacks to 2002. Yeah, Peter actually escorted me out of police headquarters, and I had been back for various reasons, but that brings back a lot of memories. I just want to start with a quick story about Michael. He gives great quotes, and I did a story on Pizza giving away personal customer information to Toronto Police without a warrant, and he's always good for a quote, and so it was something to the effect of Pizza is delivering more than pizza. Yeah. This panel is like a dream panel for me. I know all these people up here quite well. I work with Wendy at the Star. She's a terrific crime reporter. Julius, I've known him since he was a student, and he's a sociologist at UofT. Watched his career grow over the years. Some of the people who are involved in that 2002 series are teachers of his, actually. Well, one of them is Scott Wardley. And then this guy, Chris Williams, he and I have been up to some good trouble together. He's been on the front page of the Toronto Star. He FOI'd his own carding information and then shared it with the Toronto Star in one of our many investigations into carding. He is an activist, but also an academic. He wears many hats. It's hard to keep track of which one he's wearing. Sometimes, you go to him for a quote, and he's like, "I can't talk to you right now because I'm working for the government." But then when he's freed up, he can speak his mind, and when he does use his voice, it's quite powerful. Welcome to this panel. It's called Making Sense of IT, all, the role of journalists, academics, and activists in the future of public safety. And while we can talk a little bit about tech, this panel is really not about tech. It's about the work we do and the roles we play, which is what this is all about, and what we're going to do in the future to educate the public and keep things safe and hold powers to account. So super panel, I've never moderated before, so I don't think I'll ever do it again because this is just too hard to top, this panel. So the first question I'm going to ask is, for those who are here today listening, and if you weren't, what in terms of tech and crime freaks you out? Keeps you up at night? Chris?
I don't know if it keeps me up at night. Certainly not the technology per se. What I've been reading about lately primarily pertains to, the use of AI as it applies to police body cameras. Some of the large language programming that's been developed, justice text, and some other technologies. And so I think that, those technologies have been rather promising. I think it's Jennifer Eberhardt down at Stanford who did an analysis of 600 stops in Oakland, California. And the predictive value of the work she did is considerable. I think the basic finding was that within the first 27 seconds of an interaction with a police officer, say a traffic stop, 27 seconds, roughly around the first 45 words spoken by the officer had a high degree of predictive value vis-a-vis whether or not the officer decided to effectuate a search, an arrest, etc. So I think those technologies, if we're talking about the use of the technology in a bilateral or multilateral fashion, not just use for, in relation to criminals, but also police officers, in furtherance of the aim of fostering a greater degree of professionalism and accountability, I think those technologies do have, some good degree of value. The problem is that you have, certain actors, reactionary actors, in the form of police unions who have stepped in certain instances to block, to nullify the use of those technologies. That was the case, for example, in Seattle. There's a notorious case of a Seattle police officer last fall who was cracking jokes after one of his colleagues had killed a 26-year-old university student. Officer was going 50 miles over the limit, hit her, killed her, and then there's an officer saying, maybe we'll give her, $11,000 settlement to her family, and she wasn't going to amount to much of anything anyway. Some of you will remember this very disgusting body cam footage, and that was flagged by, it was either, I think it was Justice Text or another similar technology. And in response to that, you had the police, I guess they call them unions there, police association, basically was up in arms and eventually created a situation in which that technology was no longer used. So it's a funny state of affairs where the efficacy of that technology is a reason why certain parties have an aversion to it. And so if you want to talk about scare, what is it, fear, what terms did you use?
Keeps you up at night, or?
Yeah, I mean, what keeps me up at night is just the potential acceleration of a state of affairs in which these technologies are being used in a unilateral fashion rather than, I think, the bilateral and multilateral manner in which they should be used. So that's primarily what I've been reading about in the last little while. AI as productive in relation to the aim of police accountability and professionalism. So that's, and I do think that when those interventions are engineered by police unions and other, what I'd call reactionary actors, it is quite troubling.
I failed to mention, if you have questions, go ahead and interrupt. And if you're online, go ahead and send questions in. Julius, what keeps you up at night?
Lots of things. When it comes to this technology that we see right now being deployed, I am concerned about the implications for our privacy. I'm concerned about reinvesting in the existing structures of policing, which these technologies invariably do. I'm very concerned that these technologies, for the most part, are being rolled out or deployed in manners that outpace our knowledge of the efficacy of these technologies in many ways, particularly in the Canadian context. I'm very wary of generalizing evaluation findings from the United States to Canada. We have a different social fabric and composition of our society here. We have similar but also slightly different, I think, social issues in many key areas. I'm concerned about these technologies being deployed along the existing axes of the same communities and individuals that suffer from police surveillance, police violence. I'm concerned about these technologies being deployed against communities with large racialized populations, lower income communities. I'm always immediately wary of any sort of technology that the police are eager to adopt. I think that that should be a red flag for all of us, considering the implications of these technologies. And I'm concerned about these technologies being used discursively as a means to deflect attention away from ongoing, structural, systemic, cultural issues within Canadian policing that are the driver of some of these issues when it comes to the subculture of day-to-day policing, when it comes to day-to-day policing practices. And I'm concerned that many of these technologies draw on existing historical police data sets that were collected under the confines of police officers who work in a climate that's influenced by either explicit or implicit biases, and we see those reflected across the criminal legal system. So in that sense, I'm very wary of these technologies and how they're being adopted. I think that when police use these technologies as a means of saying, well, if we're seeing injustices or patterns that we seem to be concerning in police practices, deflecting that attention away by saying, well, that's based on this predictive policing model, or that's based on this set of data here. And then when it comes to the processes of our justice system in terms of how people are processed, I'm very concerned about the way that large language models, AI, and other predictive technologies are being used for risk assessments. I think risk assessments in and of themselves are fundamentally dangerous concepts. I think trying to measure and govern risk and risky individuals, this has been sort of the push of the criminal legal system in the climate that we've been in for the last 30 or more years. And I'm very concerned, again, that the data that's being used for those risk assessments, we know very little about where that data was collected. Was that data collected for the purposes of these types of risk assessments? I'm concerned about understanding what happens within these sort of black box models that are being used to assess, criminogenic risk for individuals. And really, we're talking about their life outcomes, their families and their communities as well. And that this is going to supplant in many ways the more clinical, validated risk assessment procedures that we've relied on for quite some time right now. So to put it shortly, I'm concerned that these technologies are going to replicate and extend existing problems in our criminal legal system, and that they'll turn our attention away from the human aspect of the problems that we have right now, that these are not policing problems, these are social and structural problems in terms of improving the life outcomes of people who suffer in our criminal legal system. So that's what I think about when somebody comes to me and says, hey, here's the latest policing technology.
So you're not sleeping at all?
Hardly ever. You can't tell?
The humanity part, though, it does come back to that, and as Peter is noting, that is sort of a common thread through everything today. Wendy, how about you?
Wow, it's hard to follow these two. I think I would jump off a couple of things that both Chris and Julius have said. For me, for a while I was covering a lot of facial recognition technology stories, and perhaps it's helpful to hear a little bit about one case study, if you will, that happened in Toronto that probably some of you already know about a bit, was Clearview AI, facial recognition technology that was rapidly adopted by police services across North America and in Canada. And we realized it was being adopted here in Toronto, and started putting some questions to police services across the GTA and then ultimately across Canada, and realized that police officers were using this technology without the knowledge of anyone higher up, without any approval from the police chief or the boards, or specifically any oversight. And for me, it really illustrated how technology can outpace oversight, and that's something to be incredibly wary of. And I think to hit on some of the themes of this panel is where we can kind of step in as journalists and academics and activists to pay attention to make sure that that oversight is going to be present before new forms of technology are adopted. What was interesting was police officers had attended a conference where they learned about this technology, which, by the way, I'm sure most of you know what it is, but it was a company that had scraped millions or billions, I can't remember, of images off of the internet and then created a database of images that investigators could take pictures of unidentified suspects. Unfortunately, they could also take pictures of like child sexual assault victims that hadn't been identified or child pornography, and use those to identify victims or suspects. And so it's incredibly powerful and incredibly potentially important to rapidly progress investigations, but at the same time it was being used by individual officers who had just gone to a conference, signed up for a Clearview AI account, and then just started fiddling away. And it was used, if I'm not mistaken, in 84 real investigations in Toronto before the police chief here realized that it was being used. And so to me, that has always served as kind of an example of where else is this happening, and how can I, as a journalist, ask the right questions to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again. It also, for me, illustrates, and just to introduce maybe a little bit of tension to this panel, potential of technology, right? I mean, this was not, by and large, a bad thing that should never be used. In my view, based on the research and the interviews that I did, it has significant potential. So it's about finding the right balance between personal privacy and the greater good of solving these heinous crimes. So that keeps me up at night, but also gives me some hope. And then I think one really excellent point that I just want to emphasize from Julius was, I've covered so many cases and for years been covering the issue of police reform. And again and again, I do see when there are calls for massive dramatic changes to public safety and how it's done, the answer is somehow always body cams or technology in some form, and that's a theme that maybe we can explore a little bit more. But it always seems to be, people do want tangible answers to things. So I understand why, after somebody dies and there's questions about what happened in the police interaction, it's understandable to want to introduce, okay, well, we're going to make everybody wear body cams or whatever the next technology is or will be. But at the same time, it sometimes feels like they're missing the point.
Yeah, speaking to the power of these tools, I mean, in our own business, AI is a hot topic of discussion. And just a couple weeks ago at the Toronto Star, AI's been around for like a year. Generative AI's been around for about a year and a half, and we only just got guidelines for our newsroom about how to use it and not use it. And so you can't blame those police officers for grabbing a tool they just saw and trying it out. But it does speak to the larger questions of the power of the tool and the problems with the tools, and garbage in, garbage out is a problem as well with these tools. Thinking of our respective roles, what do we have to do or keep doing to ensure that the public is educated about our public safety issues, and that we do have a safer society to live in, while also keep in mind Indigenous and Black overrepresentation is a huge problem that hasn't gone away. Chris, do you want to take a swing at that?
I mean, I think we're talking about public pedagogy and public policy regarding, crime and public safety. I mean, there's a few things, right? Like, from my standpoint, I think that from an activist standpoint, a key task is the task of demystification, right? There's so many myths about victimization that circulate within the field of public discourse that it's a highly problematic state of affairs. I think Michael Bryant touched upon this, right? The role of fear, for example. If we focus on the crime, which keeps people up at night the most, homicide, for example, we know that about 84% of homicide victims knew the person who killed them, right? So it's family members, acquaintances, non-spousal lovers, criminal associates or a drug dealer being killed by a customer, et cetera, and notwithstanding that fact, the fear of the unknown remains remarkably salient. I think that if members of the public had a more accurate understanding of where threats emanate, discussions around public safety and how best to ensure public safety would shift quite dramatically. But if that shift was precipitated, would it be functional for criminal justice actors? Like, I can't help but notice that I haven't heard a police chief ever stand up and say, hey, it's your family members, friends, neighbors, acquaintances, co-workers, et cetera, who are the biggest threats to you in relation to violent crime. And aside from robbery, most violent crime does take place between people who know each other. So I think that the first thing is, some appropriate measure of demystification, and the flip side of that, clarification. Because I think public policy cannot be founded upon mythology. I think in addition to that, certainly I think there needs to be a stronger appreciation of the limits of the criminal justice system in relation to public safety. You just think about it. Within the criminal justice system, right, for example, prisons, they can't control crime, right? We had the correctional investigator earlier this year, Ivan Zinger, who talked about a precipitous increase in inmate violence. And so you have these total institutions characterized by comprehensive coercion and surveillance. And even in those settings, they cannot or will not keep people safe. We touched upon the sheer volume of individuals charged. I think, Michael, you touched upon charges. We look at persons charged. In a typical year, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of about almost 50,000 people charged a year. I think 2023, it was about 590,000. And notwithstanding, that voluminous number of charges, about 50,000 a month, we still hear, a nonstop drumbeat of, fear-based rhetoric around crime. Well, if you're charging 50,000 people a month, and there's apparently still a troubling abundance of crime in the society, that obviously highlights the limitations of the system, which is ostensibly charged with the task of keeping us safe. And then I think, if we're talking about public education, I think maybe a third pillar, and this is of course non-exhaustive, would be some attention paid to the fact that the criminal justice system is itself known to be, in certain instances and situations and contexts, a criminogenic entity, a multifaceted criminogenic entity. And so a lot of the discussions, I think, around the criminal justice system are severely truncated, because it's either people claiming that the criminal justice system effectively reduces crime, or people claiming, like, it's almost like a null hypothesis, right? Like or a null proposition. It has no effect. But you look at some of the research, especially some of the research out of the United States, and it shows that no, there's actually a third possibility that the criminal justice system generates levels and degrees of criminality above and beyond what would otherwise exist. And I think, Michael, you had an expression there, what is it? The war feeds upon itself. Todd Clear of Rutgers, formerly of the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, wrote a book called, what was it called? Imprisoning Communities, How Mass Incarceration Makes Disadvantaged Communities Worse. And the expression he used was that the criminal justice system does in part create its own business. And so his thesis is essentially a bit of a tipping point thesis, where he argues that once incarceration goes past a certain level, the injurious impacts in terms of intensification of economic immiseration, reductions in parental efficacy, repudiations of pro-social beliefs, all of those factors coalesce in such a way that the criminal justice system, in fact, creates more crime. And I think that, Jim, you've been with the Star for what's been 30 years or so? Mm-hmm. Wendy, you've been almost 15 years? So you got about 45 years of journalistic experience between the two of you. And so you all are very well aware of the fact that the same communities that were designated as high crime 30 years ago, by and large, are still designated as such today. right? Why is that? I mean, thousands and thousands of arrests in certain individual communities, and nonetheless, these issues persist. So I think the demystification, I think recognizing the limits of criminal justice and recognizing the criminogenic consequences of certain criminal justice interventions are all sort of very, very pivotal aspects of public education, public pedagogy, and creating a more clear state of affairs. And those, I think, are the necessary prerequisites for effective public policy interventions.
Yeah, Michael. Just got to get you a microphone there. Maybe the one up there? Yeah.
Yep. It's a question for everybody, but I wanted to hear a bit about the countervailing pressures facing journalists, especially who are reporting on crime. And, you know, of all news outlets, Toronto Star is the most likely to do a feature story on some of the topics we've raised here. But when you're filing the story on a conviction or a murder, or on growing tension around fears of gun violence in the Danforth, or whatever it may be, that perspective doesn't show up in that article, presumably. Plus the phenomenon of, and when I say the pressures, I mean in part the culture as well, around journalism awards. So if the goal is to get an award so that you can and the way to do it is to break a big story, isn't the pressure to, in fact, engage in fear-mongering? That's really what I'm asking. How do you deal with the pressures of fear-mongering, and how do you balance out I'm going to write a story about homicide, but, I should mention that suicides are 10 times more likely to take place than homicides. You get my point.
You anticipated where I was going with this. I was going to pin Wendy down on this one, but yeah, I mean, the media plays a huge role in how people get their information about crime, and those quick stories, context is everything. So, when we're reporting on gun violence, we should put it in context that this year is, it's nothing unusual. Canada's safe. But in the heat of the moment, most reporters are not going to do that. And yeah, I think the Star does a better job than most of contextualizing, and largely because we have Wendy, on many of these stories. But Wendy, maybe you can speak to that point that the fear that people get from reading our stories, and quite often that results in moral panics and bad policy that undermines everything that Chris was talking about.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the challenge is when you're working on the stories, as you rightly anticipated, you're under a tight deadline. You're chasing, reaction from the neighborhood. You're trying to get the family of someone who may have been suddenly killed, and you do not want to understate how scary that can be for that family and for these communities, and particularly for communities that are victimized by a higher number of shootings and see more homicides. But on the other hand, as you absolutely rightly point out, it is incredibly important that we contextualize the information. And so it's a delicate balance of making sure that you're able to convey how scary this is, how horrific it is for a family and for a community, while at the same time not making, building up a froth of fear. And that can absolutely be really challenging. I think a good example is maybe more recently some of the violence we've seen on the TTC. Last year, that was obviously a huge concern we had. It can often start when there is like one egregious example, and as you probably remember, there was a young boy that was randomly killed on the GTC, and that was after there were a series of assaults and other horrible incidents, and as a result, the Toronto Police ended up sending out sort of like a special crew of officers for a period of time. And I remember I actually wasn't as actively involved in that coverage at the time, but I remember every day feeling like, okay, how do we find the right balance of honoring that people really are scared to take the TTC right now, at the same time, trying to contextualize and making sure that we are saying it's actually still quite safe to take the TTC. And I remember having conversations with friends who were not taking the TTC anymore, and I was like, I wonder if that's because of us, or we definitely play a role, and the media can never, ever forget that. To address the second part of your question about awards, I've certainly never felt pressure to try to win awards based off of if it bleeds, it leads style coverage. It's actually more, and I don't know how reassuring this is or not, but awards tend to honor more investigative, systemic, smart, in-depth coverage, and less daily sort of we're exposing the violence that happened quickly today, and so I don't think that's a factor as much as more just the daily grind and the pressures of deadline that can mean that stories get out there without the proper context. And then also, we haven't really discussed this yet, and I'm sure we'll get to it, but just the resourcing issues that exist in news agencies now, where reporters are doing 3 or 4 stories a day when they used to do one, and running out to scenes to get reaction, and then running off to another story, and not being given the time and space to necessarily tell the full context of a story.
Yeah, last night in this space, we celebrated the Michener Awards. Kim Cairns wrote a book about Canada's Pulitzer Prize for journalism. And to Wendy's point, I mean, public service journalism is something that I think all of us strive to do. That's what we want to do. With crime coverage, though, I think a lot of media fall into, they cover it like it's a sporting event. Last night, this happened in that neighborhood, and that's it. And so-and-so has been charged. And that's easy, right? The police feed you that information. Every morning come in, there's press releases, and it's inexpensive journalism to do that kind of reporting. So contextualizing is essential, even in those shorter stories, I think, is the best way to do it. Julius, your role as an academic, do you want to touch on that and keeping us all safe?
Well, I've never won any awards, so I have nothing to worry about in that regard. So I think there is a really powerful and important role for academia to play in this, and it's a role that academia has not always played well. So I'm a sociologist and criminologist by trade. I've done my work here at UofT primarily, and my issues are focused on the GTA. And we are, I think, quite fortunate in our local context here to have many brave, brilliant, and outspoken academics, Scott Wortley, Robin Maynard, Akwazi Wusu-Bempah, Kanika Samuels, and others, Tim Bryant, who speak regularly about these issues. But historically, I think that our disciplines have unfortunately been quite siloed in these conversations. I think that there's been historically a trend that folks in academia have reserved those discourses for other sort of academic spaces, have not necessarily been public voices on some of these issues. That's not a universal truth, but it's an issue that, this is not me saying, this is something that many eminent and notable scholars in our field have pointed out, that there needs to be a push for more public academia, public sociology, public criminology, to be engaged with discourses. I think back to 2016, I attended the annual meeting of the American Society of Criminology, and Ruth Peterson, an extremely eminent researcher and scholar in the United States, gave a keynote address in the time of Donald Trump and other issues about this rising climate of post-truth that we're all living in, and this rising climate of counterfactual narratives, and this duty that we have as scholars, as researchers, to go out and share our information and to counter these discourses, and to share this information in a manner that is accessible to the public, that is free of the jargon and conventions and trappings that make sometimes academic research inaccessible for the individuals who are most affected by the issues that we study as people who study the criminal legal system. I'm also very cognizant of the fact that we are in a situation right now in Canada where there is a rising proliferation of so-called common sense narratives around the criminal legal system. I was watching the television last night, and a commercial came on for the leader of the Conservative Party federally, and this was, common sense was at the center of that advertisement. And this is, part of a wider climate of penal populism, right? So we have a climate where we're talking about evidence-based approaches to certain issues, and the disconnect between what the evidence suggests that we should do about certain issues and what's actually happening in practice, I think that's an issue that we need to be aware of. And the point was made by Michael that, and others, that we generally do live in a safe society, but I also want to offer that safety is not enjoyed equally by all, that safety is not patterned that safety is patterned down racial lines, ethnic lines, immigration status, neighborhood lines as well. And when we look at crime data and we talk about crime data in the public sphere, we're talking about traditionally official crime data that comes from the police. And a large proportion of property crimes and violent crimes go unreported to the police and undetected by the police. And when we ask why those issues happen, it's because people don't trust the police to keep them safe. They don't think that the police have their interest at heart, and they won't go to the police when they have problems. Last bit on this, it's sort of the role of academia. I think it's important for us to be engaged in these issues, and it's important for us to work with folks like Jim and Wendy, and I've been very privileged to have opportunities to speak to both of them over the years about some of these issues, and I feel very privileged that we get called upon to talk about these issues. And the long-form work that the Star does and other outlets, in a climate of constrained resources and constrained attention spans and diminishing media literacy, what is the climate today to have, a long-form series like Race and Crime come out that, for me was one of the touchstone moments that broke open this conversation that we're having right now about racial inequities in our justice system. So I'm very cognizant of that, and I'm very cognizant that, for powerful actors in our criminal legal system who set the tone of what public safety is, we talked about fear of crime. I think the other issue here is security, right? And the police are securitizing actors. The police have the ability to shape the domain of what security is, and the police have long had the privilege of defining what is the appropriate responses to those issues. So to have security, we need to have insecurity as a relational concept. And I think there's an increasing movement of people in the public who are recognizing that we can't rely on those official discourses, that there needs to be democratization of information about the criminal legal system, it needs to be more open, transparent, and accessible. And that, the police have long looked to us, the public, and said, we need to be co-producers of community safety. We also need to be co-producers of police accountability as well. So, I could speak about this at length, but I think we have a hand over here.
Yeah, we're going to get to the questions in a sec here. That Race and Crime series that Julius was talking about was the one that got me kicked out of the headquarters with Peter escorting me out. Shri, speaking of public service journalism, Shri has a question over here. She's one of our columns at the Toronto Star, and also this year she's got a year off to be a journalism fellow here at Massey College.
Oh, thanks, Jim. And I'm also smiling a lot now because I'm a fellow and I'm on a sabbatical. I think my question is for all of you. You're, brilliant set of panelists. Wendy, you mentioned, if it bleeds, it leads. Michael, in your keynote, you talked about how data was not leading the decision behind bail reform. And this disconnect that you just talked about, Julius, was... I feel like the media is also responsible for a lot of the disconnect between what experts are saying, what the data is saying, and making that connection between expertise and political games and what the public needs to know. So in terms of that, the point I want to make is within the lines that we are allowed to draw, crime, there's a fake urgency, we have to do it really quickly, contextualize a quick story. These are all really good steps. But do you feel like the media, and this is a question for all of you, not just for the journalists, do you feel we are good at genuinely taking a step back and introspecting on what do we define as crime if the data shows that I don't really need to worry so much about crime from an unknown, from a stranger, but that a far bigger cause of crime in society could be that many of us are going to lose our jobs because somebody committed a white-collar crime, right? Do we think of crime, white-collar crime, in the same salacious way, or maybe we think of it as more as gossip? But there are boundaries and blocks to covering that kind of crime because perhaps of relationships with corporate bosses, right? So how do we, as a society, take that back step and even redefine what we see as crime in a developed country like Canada?
Great question. Who wants to try that one? Wendy?
It is a really good question. I wonder where our modern conception as reporters comes from about what exactly is crime. Like, I think people know that my title is technically crime reporter, although I've always felt it doesn't quite fit for me because I cover a lot of police accountability and justice stories. I think people sort of imagine someone who just races out to a scene and covers a homicide, and so I don't feel like it quite works for me. So maybe it doesn't actually quite work for what we should be covering as well. And I think we need to be constantly questioning that. I mean, I do think that a public service that, especially a local paper like the Toronto Star provides, is telling people about deaths that have happened. And so I think probably that's where some ideas of, we don't let someone go killed in this city without noting it. And I promise not to go off on too much of a tangent here, but one thing that I've been fighting really recently is the non-naming of victims of crime, specifically homicide, specifically domestic and intimate partner violence crimes, because it's perceived as a private affair, and it's this huge regression, in my opinion, on reporting on these stories, and it's an issue that's very close to my heart because I really strongly do believe that journalists serve the function of telling people what happened in their communities and what happened and I guess telling the stories that illustrate bigger social problems. And so that's why I feel passionate about telling, the types of more typical crime stories. But you're right that there are much larger crimes that take place that we don't cover in the way that we would a death, a murder. And it's a good question about why we don't. I mean, it could come down to resources, but I do think it's actually more an issue of perception, that we don't see, for example, corporate crime as evil as we should. So I will think on that more.
Okay, we got a question over here.
I think the democratization of data is really an interesting concept too, because I think there is the democratization of data, but then it gets so dulled because of stupid statements by politicians. I don't want to make this political, but we all know what they are. And then that counteracts, and then the public service then has to react against that. And they're busy with problems that aren't supposed to exist because people have said things that aren't true. And then you have the data that comes in and it becomes sound bites on TV, or not to preclude your investigative journalism and daily reporting, because I think that's wonderful. It's just how and where we democratize is so important, and how do we dispel the notion that we can't trust people that are there to protect us and advocate for us. And I think that's a really interesting conundrum, like how and where we dispel myths and democratize information and increase know-how is a particular problem. It's because of so many silos and so many mistruths out there. So it's more of a comment than a question.
Yeah, the problem too is fewer people than ever are actually tuning into fact-based journalism, right? And we have to pay our bills, so there's a paywall on our site, and it used to be that the Saturday paper got delivered to 1.3 million people in Ontario, and now it's below 100,000, and digital subscribers were close to, I think, 85,000, and that limits people's access to good information. There was a question from Tom.
And then over here. The points that Wendy and some of the other panelists have been making about how crimes are reported, and it bounces back to a question that I wanted to ask Michael, which is that we've talked a lot about data, but there also is the data of public opinion when we talk about the justice system and bail. And in Michael's excellent address about bail and those who are incarcerated and whether they're in crimes and so on, the facts of the matter are, by a vast percentage, 75, 80%, Canadians find our justice system too lenient, 2/3 want to have the bail system tightened. I guess I'm pointing to Michael because he was a practicing politician for so many years. How do our politicians respond, and you were critical of the federal government tightening up the bail system, when you've got 60, 70, 80% of people saying, we're fearful, we're worried, do something, and then we have an excellent seminar like today, which is bringing up a whole series of facts which counter those prejudices, which are in part inflamed by the natural stories that you write, which is a story of murder on the TTC, but it scares everybody again, and then it jumps up to 81. So aren't we in a vicious cycle when we're talking about data and evidence and so on, and criticizing our political leadership when they're dealing with 80% numbers?
Mike, do you want?
Now you see why I put this panel for the last one.
Yeah, I think that just standing up and saying, no, you don't understand. This is not going to work, and it's a recipe for a cabinet shuffle. I think that one of my points is that there's a lot of house cleaning to be done in the justice sector, and that house cleaning ought to be done, should be done. Most of it in areas where there's no heat. There's not a lot of public pressure around it. When those issues come around, and they will come around, I think they do, if they're rhetorically driven and they're driven by metaphor and the language of metaphor, then I think the political response ought to be through the language of metaphor, and not in the case of a legislator bringing in legislation that may or may not make matters worse. Now, that is a pretty good example. So when I look at that law, I think what that law does at the end of the day is it will delay things. It's actually not going to create more onerous conditions at the end of the day, because it's already the case that in essence the onus is on the defendant to not be detained, even if in law it's otherwise. So I think that those are marginalized issues, but when they come up, the best answer I've got, and I've seen it done recently in British Columbia by David Eby, the Premier, he has a very rhetorical answer that speaks to the fear, and then he brings in policies that do pretty much the opposite. So he'll speak to a challenge and then bring in a policy that in essence is more aligned with what you'd expect from a new Democratic Party. So I think it's about fighting fire with fire. So if it's operating at this level of unreality, don't make it worse, for goodness sakes, by bringing in new legislation. But I think it's a marginal matter, and I don't know, like from a journalist, like you know what the deal is with bail, what the numbers are, but if somebody commits a crime while they're out on bail, that's a story. Like, you can't avoid that. Yes, you could contextualize it, as you said, and I don't think I'm answering your question satisfactorily, but that's the best I can do.
It's a good answer, I think.
Could I hop in on that just for a second?
Yeah, Julius.
Michael, something that you mentioned earlier really struck me, and you talked about not wanting to be perceived as soft on crime, right? And what elected official wants to be pilloried as being soft on crime, as being anti-police. And we have a climate whereby even progressive politicians like our mayor here in Toronto has acquiesced to police demands to have more police. And there's no convincing systematic evidence that simply volume of police, more hiring of police, makes our society safer. And you mostly mentioned police chiefs. We talked about Chief Fantino at one point in time, was one kind of operator, and our contemporary police chiefs across this country are very smart, savvy political operators as well. And their tenures tend to outlast the tenures of our elected officials. And when we talk about, reflexive responses to crime that involve more punitive sanctions, these are politically expedient responses to solutions, but people want to see something done. You mentioned on the TTC, the surge of overtime officers coming down, and Chief Demke said this is not about safety objectively, this is about producing a subjective sense of safety in the public. And I think this also speaks to the fact that when we talk about these changes and concerns around, political pandering to either side on these issues or about political expediency, the individuals who are most disproportionately subject to these harms that come from these policies and procedures are people who we've largely cast out of our society in many domains. People who have been thoroughly racialized, dehumanized, othered, and made to seem as less than. So, when those political conditions exist and when those ideological conditions exist, the harms of those policies, are seldom thought of, I think, critically by the public, and certainly not by the constituencies that many of our elected officials seek to reach out to and seek to court in their process. So, I don't count on elected officials having not only the will, but I think also the platform to seek the kind of meaningful, long-term, systemic structural changes needed to deal with the root causes of criminalization in a climate that's characterized by fear and increasing divisiveness and a loss of trust in our democratic institutions, in our media, in academia, and other sources of seemingly legitimate information.
Chris, did you want to touch on that, or we got a question back here?
Go to the question.
Okay.
So I had a quick question about journalism. I was in journalism for a long time, but I was just wondering what makes a crime story a news story, and I wonder if I can ask you to talk a little bit about your relationship with the editors. Are there any situations where you think this is an important story and your editor says, no, it's a known story, or vice versa?
Yeah, the big spike, yeah. I don't actually cover a lot of crime. I cover the justice system and injustices in it. And I don't have a problem with I just got a new boss this week. I haven't talked to him yet, so hopefully he's on the same page.
He's good.
But I don't have a hard time pitching a story and having it picked up. But there can be challenges there. But around crime stories, I think Wendy's probably better suited to. I don't think she's been told no either.
Yeah, I'm lucky to not experience that too often, and I think it's just a little bit of experience. I do think that if you work long enough in journalism, you develop an instinct for story. For me, I absolutely, I mentioned it earlier, I'm really attracted to stories that will let me use one case study to illustrate a larger social issue. And anytime I get a chance to do that, I jump on it. I don't do that all the time. I am happiest when I'm covering a range of stories, and so I do enjoy doing daily news reporting. I like when I can sink my teeth into a story and have weeks or sometimes months to work on something, and then I like stories kind of in the middle where I have a week to work on it. And obviously, the more time you have, the more context, the more thought, the more artistry hopefully can be brought to it, and ultimately. It sounds quite lofty, but I hope to change people's minds or change people's perspectives or give them a little bit of nuance that might, give a different perspective on something that's happening in the news. In terms of, really basically answer your question, what is a crime? I mean, we like I said before, do try to cover when someone is killed, whether it's by homicide or in traffic accidents, and then if there is a series of events that's happening that becomes a bit more of a trend, and I hate to use that word in the context of crime, but if there's a series of assaults that happen in Christie Pitts or something, we will probably pay attention to that after a certain point, because we do have a public service function as well, to alert people to, safety concerns that might be happening in their communities, and also potentially to help identify suspects or perpetrators. So at the very basic level, there's a really fundamental public service that journalism does, and then which is just like, here's what's happening. This is what's happening. This is what happened yesterday. You should know about it. All the way up to, this is actually what's causing what happened yesterday, if that makes sense. And so that's why having folks like this to call and say the things that I'm not technically allowed to say as a journalist, because I'm supposed to be objective, and have them weigh in on with their opinions and provide insight. So as a short answer though, I'm happy to say I don't face a lot of pushback, and I don't mean to plug the Toronto Star, but I have to. I work at a place that aligns with the reasons why I got into journalism, which is public service and progressive values, and so I don't face the kind of pushback that I know other newsrooms might have.
I think there's also a concerted effort at the Star to be smarter about all areas of coverage, including crime. To that end, we fairly recently stopped publishing the names of people who have been charged for certain offenses. You might have noticed that. It's got to be a pretty high level, like you've killed someone or you're accused of killing someone, you get named. A string of sexual assaults, you get named. But everything else, it's really not appearing in our pages anymore. Another effort, I think Wendy's on this committee, the depublishing committee. It's really hard to scrub your name off the internet, but we will depublish stories based on individual requests. So if you're 18 and you did something stupid, short of killing someone, and you want your name removed from a story about that thing you did because you can't get a job, we will now consider taking it down from the Star, but chances are it's somewhere else as well, but that's somewhat related. Question? Kim.
Thank you. This is a wonderful panel, and I've spent a long time as a journalist and a journalism professor, and now, and one of the things I used to talk about was the episodic crime reporting, and how that elevates this sense of danger, especially among our seniors. And but one of the things I'm wondering about is, how do you build in, maybe it's a double-barreled question, how do you build in empathy into stories that you're just banging very quickly off, considering the families or the situations, the officers even, and also how do you take care of yourself when you're constantly exposed to this kind of violence, just the ugly side of life? Thank you.
It's definitely a Wendy question.
Building in empathy. That's a major priority for me, and I think journalism has come a really long way in terms of being trauma informed. I would say in the last 10 or 15 years, I did my master's at Toronto Metropolitan University, and I don't recall there being a ton of sort of work around how to tell stories in a trauma-informed manner, and now that's probably on day one, I assume. And the latter half of your question is one I get asked all the time when I speak to journalism students. Is like, how do you take care of your mental health? And I think that's such a good sign too. I think it's just a matter of how you conduct yourself. When I'm speaking to younger reporters in the newsroom, yes, you have a lot of pressure in the newsroom to get the story, get the family, get the person that's closest to what happened, but not at the expense of furthering their trauma. And I do think that alongside the changes that have been happening, kind of potentially in journalism schools, internally in newsrooms, there has hopefully been a bit of a culture change. I would think Jim would probably agree with me a bit, that there isn't as much pressure always to get get the family. So I think that's a change. And then taking care of myself. I think it's just a matter of knowing if I've done a series of really hard stories, I will try to do something that's a little bit lighter. I'm not always successful there. And then the Star has really good benefits for mental health therapy support, so that's there too. But yeah, it's funny, you never really know what stories are going to impact you. I've covered a lot of traumatic stories, and some really affect you and stay with you more than others. And as much as I love what I do, I don't know that I'll do it forever, because it can have a longer tail. So I do cover, as I mentioned earlier, like a lot of crime stories, but I like to focus on police accountability as well. And so as those stories can be incredibly troubling, but you're not always exposed directly to someone who's just lost someone, unless you're, of course, covering a fatal police shooting, of which I've covered many, unfortunately. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, the days of just suck it up and move on are past, thankfully. I covered the Paul Bernardo trial from start to finish, and that was back in the era when it was, just go to the bar, I skip forward to, like I said, I don't cover a lot of crime, but when I do, it's a big one. Russell Williams, another serial killer. And that was many, many years after Bernardo, and it impacted a lot of journalists. I think I was better prepared for that kind of stuff because of Bernardo, but people got help. Like they didn't just suffer. Dave Segmans from the CBC is now a wellness ambassador for the CBC, because he went through an episode after covering Russell Williams. It's PTSD. But as Wendy mentioned, we have really good benefits. People are not afraid to use them as well. Question?
Questions, actually, it's here, but I'm just going to take a little bit of privilege. Chris, I'm interested. PTSD in policing, well documented. PTSD in journalism, not sure well documented. PTSD in activism, because I've seen some activists in this city and around this country suffer brutally. Any thoughts on that? And then I'll give my brother the...
Yeah, I mean, certainly a neglected topic. I've, been up close with, individuals, for example, who have been on the receiving end of, civilian on civilian violence, police violence. And I mean, how you manage it, I mean, for me personally, it's really fuel, when you see victims of injustice or victims of violence up close. Jim, you had a story about a young man who was the subject of a police raid a number of years ago, Fabian Clark. And the officers burst in, punched him in the face repeatedly. There was damage done to his eye, etc. The issuance of charges that were subsequently dropped. He's working, I think, installing drywall or something like that. He lost his job. And later on, I had an opportunity to meet up with Fabian Clark alongside his lawyer, Nia Singh. And you do feel, a certain sense of helplessness, because the wrong, the injustice has already unfolded. The damage, by and large, is done. And you sort of try to, attenuate some of that impact by, presenting a human face. There was something I did for him the day I met him. I won't say what it is, because it's between him and I. But yeah, I mean, it certainly does take a toll, but simultaneously, you're constantly reminded of the scale, scope, and depth of injustice in this society, and so you sort of use that, as a catalyst for the continuation of the work that is done by progressive activists in the city and beyond.
And Julius, you're working on the gun violence issue. One of the things on your plate right now. How about you with coming up against trauma?
I think I fall in the same camp as Chris. I've met and spoken to hundreds of young people across the years about gun violence, gangs, policing, and other issues in the GTA. I've spoken to people who have endured horrific loss, violence at the hands of the police, violence at the hands of others. I've seen through those accounts how those violent incidents can cascade through families, through communities, intergenerationally. And you know, I'm also cognizant that, you know, for many people who are, you know, we see them in the pages of our newspapers and we hear about them in stats and, you know, in these sort of more removed contexts for people that, you know, their voices are seldom heard in many of these issues. And I'm not saying that I'm a voice for them, but I think it's important to do this work. That's what pushes me forward to do this work. I feel I have a responsibility, a moral responsibility to do this work. It is like climbing up, you know, the side of a mountain. Sometimes it sometimes seems, you know, that you'll never reach the summit, and certainly not in my lifetime. But I do feel that we are working towards a better and more just society, and I will do whatever I can to play some small part in that.
Question I had relates to something that Michael brought up and Sri brought up. Michael asked, well, made the point that we don't have strategy when it comes to crime and public safety. And Sri asked the question, what's the difference between the impact of economic or white-collar crime and physical violence or other forms of crime? For politicians or policymakers to set priorities. This is a question for Chris and Julius. Is there any group of academics who are looking at crime or public safety in a comprehensive sense and a comparative sense? So saying, okay, well, what's the impact of overall violent crime compared to white-collar crime? What's the economic impact on different communities of different kinds of economic crime, for fraud or, you know, the taking down of a company? So that policymakers could say, okay, well, we should be prioritizing X because its impact overall is this. You know, its physical impact is this, its economic impact of this. The immediate impacts are these, or the downstream economic and social impacts are these. How do we set those priorities? How do we come up with a strategy if there is no comprehensive comparative study on crime and public safety?
I'll briefly comment on this. There is work that is going towards these points. There are folks doing research that just recently I heard a presentation by Ayo Bamilanianu, who's a faculty member here at UofT at CrimSL, talking about some of these downstream and upstream impacts and thinking more comprehensively about the impacts of property and violent crime and how can we measure them and think about them. I think this was primarily in an economic sense. And certainly there are great social harms that come from crimes as well that are difficult to study. One of the issues with making these broad comparisons is access to data. You know, Michael made this point earlier on. I wasn't here in the morning, but I'm sure this was brought up earlier as well. That, you know, this not big data as in big data, but the large data question of access to comprehensive, systematic data to understand the impacts of these issues is lacking. I will say at this point, though, that I believe we have data that is sufficient enough to begin making actionable policy decisions around some of these key issues. And I believe that data is a topic that should be of concern to us, some of the disparities that we're seeing in our criminal legal system and some of the impacts, and that should drive us to want to collect more data. So the work is happening. Comparative work is difficult to do when we lack consensus agreements about what we're investigating, when we lack shared data sets, when we lack shared priorities, and when we lack funding, time, energy, resources to do this work as well. So it's happening. It's, you know, in Canada, we often talk about this data question because historically we have not collected fulsome data on the intersections, for example, race and indigeneity in our criminal legal system. And that's not by accident, right? That is a product of the way that our system is structured. That's a product of this idea of Canadian exceptionalism that we have, that our issues in Canada are removed from the issues we see in the United States and other contexts as well when it comes to comparison. So there are real challenges to doing this work. There are resource challenges, there are data challenges, there are ideological challenges as well. The work is happening, but certainly not to the extent to make those broad comparisons that I think that you're alluding to.
And I think one of the ideological challenges is that you know, it seems to be cemented within public consciousness that threats to public safety are seen as largely emanating from, you know, the bottom quintile or bottom quartile of the population. So a lot of the discourse is invariably not only classist, but it's overlain or imbricated by racist assumptions about who constitutes the greatest threats to society. I think that when we talk about the ideological dimensions of this, I mean, it's interesting, you know, you raise a very important point about crimes of the powerful and perhaps the insufficiently calculated costs of those crimes. Because earlier this year was the 20th anniversary of the Westray Law. So yeah, the Westray Law came in 2004, now it's 2024, and one of the issues is that a lot of the harms that are visited upon individuals by corporate actors, by large employers, are simply not defined as crimes. Now, I don't know the exact numbers in terms of the numbers of corporations and individual actors within corporations who have been prosecuted under the Westray Law, but my understanding is it's minuscule, you know? So that, although the Westray Law came into being, it was, you know, I mean, if you're talking about the catalyst for that, there was a strong activist component to say that, you know, we need to really have a more capacious conception of who and what, you know, constitutes threats to public safety. You know, you sort of get what you want at the legislative level, but there's not much more than that, you know, so that's one of the challenges. And so I'm glad that Julian, you know, alluded to the ideological barriers, right? That, you know, just the nature of how public consciousness is shaped in ways that lead to tightly circumscribed ideas about where threats originate.
I think of the example, just to build on that, it was mentioned earlier about the Summer of the Gun and the Year of the Gun and Jane Kriba. You know, the tragic death of Jane Kriba was a massive catalyst for policy change, demand for policy change, but it was preceded by the Summer of the Gun, where black men were dying across the city, but they weren't dying in the downtown core. The people who were the victims and perpetrators of that violence were not cast as being either deserving victims or that, you know, they precipitated their victimization because of their associations or where they reside. And then, you know, we had this tragic act of violence that transcended those boundaries of where we expect crime and violence to happen, right? And unfortunately, it takes critical incidents like that often to catalyze policy action on these issues and to catalyze actions. And, you know, that speaks to that ideological divide that, you know, Chris is speaking to here as well.
I would just add parenthetically that within the black community, one of the sore points is that there was a York University student named Chantel Dunn who was killed in an act of gun violence. And you know, the name Chantel Dunn, if it doesn't resonate, well, that's kind of, you know, you know, why there's consternation within the community, because she was tragically killed, young, promising young woman, and didn't receive even, you know, 1/100th of the attention as the Jane Kriba shooting. Now, there are important differences because Jane Kriba's Boxing Day, broad daylight on Yonge Street, so we need to appreciate that contextual specificity, but it is still, you know, sharply asymmetrical, and that's something that we see in other situations as well. Like we talked about journalism, you know, and this is not the Star, but you have other journalistic outlets, they'll still say when someone's killed that, you know, the individual was known to police, right? So in other words, like, you know, shady character in all likelihood, so why should we give a damn, right? I'm glad the Star doesn't engage in that practice, but there are a whole constellation, I think, of you know, problematic ways in which, you know, whether it's the media or other actors who intervene in public debates, how they can sort of contribute to the dehumanization that Julius touched upon earlier.
You and I both being victims of carding, you know, we'd fall into that probably known to police parameter, your context as well, but that's a teachable moment for my students when I talk about this, that it tells us very little about individuals that they're known to the police, other than that they've come to the attention or suspicion of the police based on factors that are largely entirely out of their control.
We use that title for our series on carding, Known to Police. Literally, you are known to police because you got stopped and questioned and documented.
This thing working? Yeah. Oh, good. Chantal, she was not the intended victim, and the crime has never been solved, as I remember, seem to remember. I wanted to just go back briefly to the question of why, it's so difficult to give context, then I'll loop to something else. It's sort of that old quote attributed to Stalin. A single death is a tragedy. 1 million deaths is a statistic. And so an individual story of somebody shot on the subway really strikes the imagination of everybody. But if you give statistics, people shrug. Slightly related to that is a more general question. This is a brilliant panel and a brilliant event, I must say. Lots of expertise, a huge number of ideas, but there's a collapse in the faith in the public, large sectors of the public, of faith in expertise and ideas and policies. How do you explain that, and what can be done about it?
That was actually my wrap-up question. Thanks for asking it. Yeah, we're living through this period of misinformation, disinformation, loss of public trust in journalists, and what do we do about that is something that is a hot topic within journalistic circles, but I'll throw that question to you guys.
I mean, talk about what keeps us up at night. I mean, there's no clear answer. I think sometimes I just focus on what, as an individual, I can do, and I think that's continuing to do ethical, quality journalism that can be trusted, hopefully. I think as a journalism outlet, we need to be a little bit more transparent about, I guess, as journalists entirely, not just the Star, but all organizations, I think, would do well to be a bit more transparent around how we do our work. I think there is a lot of misunderstanding about what journalists do and how decisions get made. I think when we make mistakes, we have to own them and be clear about them, and that goes a long way to, strengthening public trust. And then I think, we have to continue to cover bad actors who are seeking to sow this discontent that is creating the division and the distrust in media. That's a real challenge, and I think it's a new challenge for newsrooms to try to figure out how to cover, for example, the far right. How to cover Trump for a really long time was a challenge, and calling out, we don't usually say the word lie. We talked about that a lot, but I think just doing what we do best, which is holding power to account and questioning these ideas that are coming up that are undermining our faith in not just institutions like journalism, but other things, academia, policing, the justice system, etc.
And then there's the whole media literacy piece, getting into schools at a younger age and teaching young people how to spot the problematic pieces of information. And I like to say that the toaster in your kitchen has more regulation than the phone that your kid has, and so like that torrent of a river of vomit is coming down into that phone, and if they're not able to deal with it, then we're really screwed. So media literacy, I think, is a key part of it. And media, we have a new initiative coming out soon. We used to have newspapers in the classroom, and then that stopped. But now I think they're about to offer free digital subscriptions to high school kids, and that has to be a part of what happens going forward, I think.
I teach with work that both of you have done in the classroom. Sorry that I don't make people get subscriptions. They access it through our library system as an institutional subscriber. I don't bring in my copy of this. I still get a printed copy of the Star on Saturdays. It's no accident that the individuals who own these social media companies that are eroding our faith in our democratic institutions and journalism and academia as well, you know, are the same institutions that in some cases are buying up our media companies as well and seeking to centralize, control the flow of information in our society. That's not me being a conspiracy theorist. I do believe, though, that there is a demand amongst the public for information, for truth, for access to information in platforms and venues and in manners that they find accessible and that are relevant to them. Part of that comes with media literacy. Part of that comes as well with increasing access to information through different means. Because I think of, you know, the movement for Black Lives. I think about, you know, the recent large movement for police defunding, detasking, whatever you want to call it. You know, increasing demands for accountability from our public institutions. So I think that there is a generation of people, young people particularly, who are anxious for change and want change. And I think that there's a need to reach those people. And I'm also, you know, very aware that we are in a climate right now of extreme polarization and in a climate where many of us are in an echo chamber. We speak to people who are like-minded individuals. Social media algorithms feed us content that reflects our interests and our biases, and you know, it's very difficult to reach across that proverbial aisle and to engage in discourses with people who hold views that are different than yours. And I think that there needs to be a concerted effort to share information in ways that reaches both sides of the aisle and to have those conversations. I wish I had the good answers about how to do that. If I did, I'd probably be some celebrity somewhere, but no, I'm just a lowly academic. But I think that need is upon us.
Chris?
Well, I think the term faith was used. You know, I recoil a little bit when I hear that term. If you want to use a functionally equivalent term, perhaps trust. Even then, I have some issues with the assumption that distrust is inherently and inexorably pathological. I think that distrust can be very healthy. I think if you look at the foundational wellsprings of democratic thought, distrust is right there. It plays a central role, which is one of the reasons why we have the separation of powers, right? Like, why don't we vest all judicial and legislative powers under the executive branch? Because we don't trust. It's because of distrust, right? I think that whatever I say or any panelist, I think we should all be heavily scrutinized. I think after the conference, if someone views the video and decides to double check things that we've said, I think that's a very healthy thing. We see real world examples of how.
Michael just said he disagrees with that.
Yeah. And yeah, so I think trust, distrust, whether it's healthy or pathological, I mean, it's very much context specific. We just saw earlier this year the conclusion of the Umar Zamir trial. I think it was a good thing that the jury didn't trust the police testimony. I think that's an example of healthy distrust. The opposite would have resulted in Umar Zamir getting a 25 to life sentence. And then on the other hand, I think there are other contexts where trust is healthy and makes a lot of sense. And just using the example of policing, I mean, there was a case a number of years ago where a young kid, a TDSB student, was kidnapped by some guys who were upset by the fact that his older brother had ripped them off. It was, he literally disappeared with hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not more. And so they snatched the kid up, kidnapped him, and demanded a ransom, right? So the Toronto police issued a very strong statement to the effect that, listen, the kid had nothing to do with anything. He's an innocent kid. You guys are taking the wrong path. We're really serious about this. Give him up. Let him go. And then they subsequently, the police got a call. I don't know who they were communicating with, who said, go up to this barn in like King City. And they went up to the barn in King City, and they found the kid physically unharmed. Obviously, you're going to have the emotional and psychological scars, etc. But I say all of that just to say that despite the fact that I think distrust in certain contexts towards police, journalists, etc., can be a good thing, I think in that case, you sort of have almost like a non-optional form of trust, right? Because it's either you trust that the police are going to get your kid or you completely lose your mind, right? So I don't adhere to any across-the-board conception that trust is always good and distrust is always pathological. I think it very much depends on it's situationally specific. I tend to be quite distrusting, so I'm kind of predisposed to say what I've just said. But again, I think that on multiple levels, including, again, just foundational democratic ideas, there is a recognition that distrust can be healthy.
Just a fact check, Chris is always right. Yeah.
And to Chris's point, that trust has to be earned.
Exactly.
And that trust has to be earned through fair treatment, transparency, and fair outcomes. And time again, many of our democratic institutions and the police and others have asked for our trust and then not earned that trust through their other actions. It's one thing, we talk about crime and violence, and we talk about issues that happen in racialized communities. We talk about the police going out and trying to investigate serious crimes, and the police come back and say, well, nobody will talk to us. Nobody will come forward and say that they saw something. That's not an accident, right? That is the product of decades of mistreatment that has engendered mistrust, right? So trust has to be earned continually, and it has to be, something that people see in the day-to-day processes of our social institutions. It just can't be expected of us in the public.
Luis.
I think usually when we think about especially crime and journalism is thinking about an exacerbating or an exaggeration of things, right? Oh, you are making a lot of noise about this thing happening, blah, blah, blah. Usually there's kind of that sense. But so I guess my question or my is about how to deal, and I would like to hear about your specific thoughts about how do you draw the line on not to normalize something, which is different than exaggerating something. And I'm telling you because of this. I come from a city deeply affected by the war on drugs. At some point, as a journalist, I have to report daily between 50 to 25 murders on the streets, shootings. Sometimes I arrive earlier than the police. So I was in contact with the hitman. The hitman was leaving the crime scene, and I was arriving to the crime scene. So I have to write about it. And the result of that, and at some point I struggled myself with, well, this is not normal. It may be normal now because we are dealing with this situation, but how can I produce journalism in a way that people in the city, and I work for a national newspaper, how can I explain to people not living in my city, this is not normal? So I guess this would be my question for you. How do you find the balance, or how do you, your internal process of, okay, this is not normal in journalism, in activism, and also in academia?
You might be the most qualified person to answer that question, Luis. You want to take a...
If I'm understanding correctly, and I agree with Jim that you're probably better suited to answer your own question, but it hits on the tension that I had mentioned kind of at the outset, which is I feel like I'm constantly trying to balance the competing sort of need to expose crime that has happened, to honor the horror and singular sadness and anguish of a family and of a community, with telling the rest of the city, like, this is a bit of a unique incident, or here's where we are at in this city when it comes to shootings, and we're actually lower, and that can make the job really hard, and it kind of just comes down to doing the legwork of being there and talking to people, and then also talking to experts like we have up on the stage here. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
It's a good answer, I think. Yeah. Time has flown by. We got 2 minutes left, and I didn't even get to ask my Batman question, which I'm really disappointed about, but we'll leave that.
I'm a Superman guy anyway, so.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Batman all day.
Do we want one more quick one, or we're good? We're good. I just want to say thank you to these guys. It's an honor to be on the stage with them, and thank you for making this so engaging, and to Peter for bringing us together here for this final part of the day. I've learned a lot. My head is kind of full from the morning session. And one thing about Massey College, and I've said this to a few people today, every time I come here, I feel like I'm the dumbest person in the room, which happened again today. So thanks, guys.
Thank you very much. So I've got the pleasure of some thanks and some wrap-up. I'll echo Jim's comment on the quality of the panel. And my sense of shrinking in the back of the room is Jim and Julius and Chris, Wendy talk with such confidence and conviction around a range of topics that I have been a voyeur to. So I just deeply grateful, and you've exceeded all my hopes and expectations for closing off an important day with your contributions. I want to thank the online audience and the folks in the room, some of whom are actually here right from the beginning and stayed right to the end. So God bless each and every one of you. Obviously, some of the folks who were panel members before have moved on. Michael was here from the beginning and stayed right to the end and provided, as I thought he would. I challenged him. I said, you're probably going to have the most difficult presentation. You were on the side of prosecution, side of defense, and you've been on both sides of the equation, and you brought just that incredible humanity into it. I want to thank my older brother David, who's there in the black shirt, who's done a huge amount of heavy lifting for months, supporting Tom's vision for this event and making sure he got me here on time and healthy. Joe, who's around the corner in the AV booth, is the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, but he's the real deal. And although you may not have seen her, but Allison was greeting folks this morning and has been popping in throughout the day to make sure that food and coffee, reception, and a whole bunch of background stuff was put in place. And there are others within the Massey community that have played a role. Last but not least is Tom. There's been different discussions throughout the day around politicians, and I've certainly expressed myself around the good, the bad, and ugly of the politics that I've been involved with. But we lost a generation of greats, and Tom is one of the ones remaining. His heart is in not in politics, not even in public service, just building this country into a better place for everybody. So I'll show up anywhere, anytime for this guy. Last but not least, this is a special space. This Massey College, there's a magic in this place for those of you that have had a chance to be here for a lot longer than I have, for those of you just visiting here today. And I encourage you to get involved, whether it's a topic like this or something much more far afield. Come here physically, join online, participate in any way that you choose. Maybe one day Wendy will have you here as a visiting journalist. Get to know the professors, just an incredible talent pool. I have learned and relearned policing and social justice from Julius, your forebearers, the people that have gone before you, and I intend to learn a lot more from you. Last and certainly not least, Chris was on the ground. I think Mukherjee hired you to do research around the carding issue. It was the first time I'd met you across the table at a deputation at police headquarters. And I got to tell you, there weren't a lot of friendlies on the other side of the room. But you came in there brave and strong, and I've seen others come into that room, Desmond Cole and many others. They're lonely moments, but they're really important. The sacrifice of journalism, the sacrifice of academia, the sacrifice of activism, I believe, are our greatest hopes to get us through this very fragile time, to keep that glass half full, to keep institutions to account, to keep this country going forward. So I'm just grateful for everyone that's contributed in any way today. We'd love your feedback, whether informally at the end as we kibitz on the way out. I'm not sure if there's a formal feedback loop for something like this, and if not, we'll build it into future ones. But if you think this was helpful, please let us know, and we'll consider to twist Tom's arm and see if we can get us together again in some other format like this in the future. go safely to where you need to be healthy wherever you go, and thank you again for all of your contributions.